The moment Lina stepped into the ballroom, the atmosphere tightened around her like a thin glass wall ready to crack. The chandeliers poured light over the marble floors, but nothing softened the sharp attention that shifted toward her. Conversations slowed, glances sharpened. A few guests paused mid-sip, as if her presence disrupted the room's choreography. Near the staircase, Clarice watched her with a brightness in her eyes that wasn't warmth. It was anticipation. Dangerous anticipation. She lifted her hand elegantly, summoning Lina forward as though she were positioning a piece on a board. "There you are," Clarice said, her voice smooth enough to hide the edge beneath it. Perfect timing. Emily and Grace, her daughters, exchanged delighted looks. Their smiles were too quick, too synchronized, carrying the energy of a secret joke they expected everyone to enjoy. Whispers rose almost instantly. "Is that the maid? Why bring her out front now? This should be interesting." Lina felt the tray grow heavier in her hands. Not from weight, she'd carried far worse, but from the strange electricity building in the room. She sensed something engineered about this moment, something intentional. The kind of cruelty that doesn't announce itself, it waits. Clarice stepped closer, her perfume drifting like a soft warning. "Stay near tonight," she murmured, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I want everyone to see you." Lina's breath tightened. She kept her eyes lowered for a second, not in submission, but to gather herself. Her pulse hammered gently at her collarbone, reminding her of every night she'd forced herself to endure slights that were supposed to feel small. But this wasn't small. This was a stage. Emily and Grace watched her, expecting discomfort, expecting the flinch, expecting the shrinking. Instead, Lina lifted her chin, barely, just enough for the chandelier light to catch the quiet strength in her face. The subtle gesture wasn't defiance, it was recognition. A silent realization that she stood at the center of something carefully set up. Clarice noticed that shift. Her smile thinned for the briefest moment. Lina didn't speak. She didn't retreat. She simply stood there, steady, composed, unmovable in a way the room was not prepared for. And though no one understood it yet, the cruelty they'd orchestrated had already begun to fracture. The music swelled just as Lina steadied her breath, but the room itself felt sharper, as if every crystal on the chandelier had turned into a watchful eye. Clarice took a slow sip from her glass, not because she was thirsty, but because she wanted the moment to stretch, wanted Lina to feel every second of it. Emily and Grace drifted closer to their mother, their expressions bright with the kind of entertainment that comes from cruelty dressed as elegance. "Lina?" Clarice said, waving her hand lightly. "Stand here, dear. The guests should be able to see you clearly." Her tone carried a softness that didn't belong to kindness. It was the softness of silk over a blade. Lina stepped forward. Her shoes made almost no sound on the marble floor, but the hush that followed her movement seemed to echo anyway. People turned, not out of respect, but curiosity. The kind reserved for someone who shouldn't be in the spotlight yet was deliberately placed there. A man near the piano whispered, "Why center her like this?" A woman beside him replied, "Clarice must be planning something." And Emily's smirk widened, confirming exactly that. Lina felt the weight of those murmurs settle against her shoulders. She kept her chin lifted just enough to maintain balance, her posture steady, though her heartbeat pulsed insistently at her throat. She wasn't unfamiliar with humiliation. She had been brushed by it many times. But tonight felt different. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't a passing comment or a sharp look from someone who believed she belonged beneath them. This was orchestrated. Clarice circled her slowly, as if inspecting her. The crowd parted to watch, their fascination growing, their amusement barely contained. "You've worked for us for so long," Clarice said, voice dripping with false appreciation. "It's only fair that everyone here knows who makes this home run so smoothly." Emily added, "Yes, Mother, she's practically part of the family." Her emphasis on practically carried a sting. Lina felt something tighten inside her chest, but she didn't react, not outwardly. Instead, she watched Clarice's movement carefully, sensing the emotional choreography unfolding around her. Clarice wasn't trying to include her. She was setting her as a contrast to the opulence around her, a reminder of her place, a pawn in a narrative crafted for the guests' entertainment. But Lina didn't shrink. She didn't let her gaze fall. She held herself with a stillness that made Clarice pause mid-step, just for a moment, before masking the hesitation with another polished smile. From across the room, Grace lowered her voice, but not enough to be missed. "Look at her! She doesn't fit here. This is going to be hilarious." The expectation of laughter flickered through the guests, subtle but present. Lina felt it like a cold draft brushing the back of her arms. Yet inside her, something steadier was forming. Not defiance, not yet, but a quiet refusal to collapse under their design. A sense that she didn't have to play the part they prepared for her. She met Clarice's gaze fully for the first time that evening. The room didn't notice it, but Clarice did, and the tiny shift in the woman's posture revealed a very small, very real fracture in her control of the moment. A fracture Lina didn't exploit. Not now, not yet. She simply stood there, unbroken, forcing the room to confront the unexpected strength of the person they had tried to turn into a spectacle. The humiliation they wanted hadn't begun, but something else had. Clarice's smile returned, polished and performative, but now there was a slight tension beneath it, an almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of her mouth. Lina had not bent the way she expected. She had not shrunk or stumbled or offered the timid expression Clarice had counted on to fuel the evening's entertainment. That single, steady look from Lina had disturbed the choreography, but Clarice refused to lose control of the scene. She clapped her hands softly, calling for attention. "Everyone," she announced, her voice sliding silk-smooth across the room, "before the festivities begin, I'd like to show you something special." Emily and Grace lit up instantly, their anticipation returning full force. Whatever humiliation they had planned, it was clear this was the moment they meant to start it. Lina felt the shift around her. The guests turned, forming a loose semicircle that framed her in the center. It was a placement designed to isolate, to highlight her as an amusing contrast to their elegance. She recognized the strategy. She'd seen it used on others before, though never quite so openly. Clarice moved to Lina's side with an exaggerated gesture, as if presenting a display item. "Here she is," she declared warmly. "Our dear Lina. She works so hard behind the scenes, doesn't she? Always quiet, always obedient." Obedient. The word hung in the air, sticky and intentional. A few polite chuckles surfaced, the kind that weren't meant to be cruel but became cruel simply because of where they were directed. Lina's fingers curled slightly at her sides, an instinctive reaction she quickly disguised by smoothing the front of her apron. Her throat tightened, but her posture didn't falter. Clarice continued, "I thought it would be lovely to bring her out tonight. After all, it's not every day that someone like her gets to stand in a room like this." More laughter, sharper this time. Lina felt the sting, quiet but deep, threading through her chest. She steadied her breathing, her eyes resting not on Clarice but on the flicker of candlelight reflected on the polished floors. She wasn't retreating. She was grounding herself, quietly choosing not to break under the weight of their amusement. Across the room, a man raised his glass. "She looks nervous," he whispered. "Of course she does," someone replied. "Imagine being paraded in front of everyone." Grace stepped closer, voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Lina, why don't you smile? You're the guest of honor tonight." The forced emphasis made several guests exchange glances, some entertained, some uncomfortable. Lina lifted her gaze again, this time directly toward Grace. Her expression didn't harden, didn't flash with anger. It simply remained composed, still, carrying a quiet dignity that didn't match the role they wanted her to play. Grace blinked, taken off guard for just a second. Clarice sensed the small disruption and quickly redirected the energy. "Well," she said, laughing lightly, "perhaps she's shy, but that's what makes her so endearing." A wave of murmurs followed, each one brushing against Lina like a cold breeze. She could feel the humiliation tightening around her, pressing inward. Yet beneath that pressure, something began to form. Not defiance, not open resistance, but a decision. A slow, internal shift. A subtle recognition that she couldn't allow them to dictate her worth. Not tonight. Not ever again. She took a single step back, not to retreat, but to reposition herself, reclaiming a sliver of space that Clarice had tried to control. The movement was small, almost invisible to most, but Clarice noticed. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, a flicker of irritation breaking through her poised facade. The music resumed softly, but the emotional tension remained thick, suspended between what Clarice wanted and what Lina silently refused to become. The evening's cruelty was supposed to begin with her collapse. Instead, it began with her refusal to bow. And though the guests didn't understand the shift, Clarice did, which made her smile return, sharper this time, almost desperate, because she realized Lina wasn't going to break easily, and that meant the game would have to escalate. Lina remained in the center of the room even after the guests drifted back into their conversations, though their eyes continued to return to her in small, curious glances. She could feel the residue of Clarice's performance clinging to the moment, a thin veil of humiliation that hadn't fully settled, because she hadn't let it. Her stillness had interrupted their script, and the subtle disruption rippled beneath the surface like a quiet current no one could name. Emily and Grace stood near the dessert table, whispering with an urgency that revealed their frustration. They had expected Lina to crumble, to blush, to stutter, something they could feed on. Instead, she had met their cruelty with calmness that made their smug delight flicker. Grace leaned toward her sister, muttering, "She's pretending. She'll slip soon." Emily replied, "Mother won't let her ruin this. Just watch." Lina heard them, but she let the words pass through her without anchoring. Not because they didn't hurt, they did, more than she wanted to admit, but because something deeper had begun to stir beneath the hurt. A sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. As if every small cruelty unfolding in that room was pressing her closer and closer to a version of herself she had once buried. Clarice approached again, graceful as ever, pretending to adjust a centerpiece as she spoke without looking at Lina. "Don't wander off," she said softly. "People are enjoying having you here." Enjoying. The word landed heavily in Lina's chest. She knew what it meant in Clarice's voice. Still, Lina didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, controlled and measured, before shifting her stance, not toward Clarice, but toward herself, claiming a fraction more of her own presence. A guest named Helen, a woman with warm eyes but uncertain posture, watched Lina longer than the others. There was no mockery in her gaze, only a question she didn't voice. Her silence felt different, observant, not cruel. When Lina's eyes met hers, Helen offered a small, sympathetic smile before turning away quickly, as if afraid to be caught caring. Lina felt the slightest ease in her shoulders, a flicker of relief that someone saw her without sharpening the edges. But she didn't allow that feeling to soften her guard. Not tonight. A waiter brushed past her, whispering under his breath, "Hold on, okay?" He didn't wait for her response. He simply kept walking, as though offering kindness was dangerous under Clarice's roof. Lina exhaled slowly. She could feel something shifting inside her, subtle but undeniable. The humiliation Clarice tried to impose wasn't sinking into her the way it once would have. Instead, it was being met by a quiet resolve, an awakening of the self she had spent years suppressing to survive. Her hands, once tense, now rested calmly at her sides. Her breathing steadied. Her gaze cleared. She wasn't naive. She knew Clarice wasn't finished. She knew the room would tighten again. She knew the humiliation would return with sharper teeth. But for the first time in a long time, Lina felt something resembling readiness, not to fight, but to withstand, to stay intact, to remain herself in a place designed to strip that away. She lifted her head slightly, the chandelier lights catching the determination in her eyes. Whatever Clarice had planned next, Lina would face it, not silently resigned, but quietly awake. Lina barely had time to process the quiet resolve forming inside her before Clarice signaled again, this time with a subtle flick of her fingers toward Emily and Grace. The daughters straightened immediately, their expressions brightening with the thrill of new instructions. Whatever their mother whispered to them across the room, it carried enough weight to ignite their eager smiles. The air shifted. Emily approached Lina first, her steps light but her intention heavy. She circled once, pretending to admire the floral arrangements behind her. "Mother thinks you should help greet the guests," she said, though her tone made it clear this wasn't a request. "It'll be adorable." Grace chimed in from the other side. "Just stand by the entrance and smile. Try not to look too overwhelmed." Their synchronized smirking revealed the real purpose. Position Lina where every guest arriving would see her first. An intentional framing meant to belittle her without a single insult spoken aloud. Lina felt the sting, deep and unmistakable. This wasn't a simple humiliation. It was a performance built on power, orchestrated moment by moment. She could feel her old instincts rising, the ones that told her to surrender, to avoid friction, to keep the peace even when it cost her pieces of herself. But something refused to fold this time. Still, she didn't argue. She walked to the entrance as instructed, every step measured, every inhale controlled. Her silence wasn't compliance. It was calculation. She needed to stay centered, present, grounded beneath the weight of every judging eye. The first guest passed by with polite confusion. "Is she greeting us? I guess she's part of the theme tonight. That's unusual, isn't it?" None of the comments were cruel alone, but the accumulation pressed against her ribs. Then came a sharper voice, a woman in a red dress who slowed deliberately as she passed. "Oh," she said with false sweetness. "You must be new. They always find creative ways to use the staff, don't they?" Lina's jaw tightened, though her face remained calm. She bowed her head slightly in acknowledgement, not out of submission, but out of discipline, choosing which moments deserved her energy and which didn't. From across the room, Clarice watched closely. Her expression was composed, but her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. She believed the humiliation was finally taking shape. But Helen, the woman with the warm eyes, noticed something Clarice didn't. She watched Lina carefully, studying not her posture, but her reaction to the cruelty. And she saw what the others missed. Lina wasn't breaking. She was absorbing, assessing, preparing. Helen stepped forward, stopping right in front of Lina. "You're doing wonderfully," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself rather than the crowd. There was no sarcasm in her voice, only sincerity. And sincerity, in that room, felt like rebellion. Lina blinked, surprised, the warmth of the words settling softly over her bruised composure. She offered Helen the smallest nod, one filled with a quiet gratitude she didn't dare speak aloud. The daughters noticed the exchange, and irritation flickered across Emily's face. She whispered sharply to Grace, "Why is she getting sympathy? That's not the point." Grace answered under her breath, "Mother will handle it." Clarice approached again, her heels slicing clean notes across the marble. She stopped just inches from Lina, her expression still smiling, but her voice low and taut. "Remember your place," she murmured, only for Lina to hear. "I won't have you drawing attention for the wrong reasons." Lina's breath hitched, not out of fear, but at the clarity of the line drawn. Clarice wasn't simply humiliating her. She was protecting something, guarding a narrative, keeping Lina small because anything else felt dangerous. And that realization, sharp, sudden, undeniable, settled into Lina's bones. Clarice stepped away before Lina could respond, leaving her standing in the doorway, framed by golden light and the distant music. But Lina didn't shrink into the frame they built around her. She inhaled slowly, letting the truth Clarice had accidentally revealed soak into her resolve. This wasn't just cruelty, it was fear disguised as power. And for the first time that evening, Lina understood that her calm wasn't resistance alone. It was the beginning of something Clarice never intended to wake. Lina walked down the side corridor with quiet steps, the echo of the ballroom fading behind her like a tide withdrawing. Only when she reached the small service room did she let the door close softly, sealing herself away from the stares that had weighed on her all evening. The hum of the party dulled into a distant vibration, and the sudden stillness made her chest both ache and loosen. Her hands trembled faintly. Not from fear, she recognized that feeling too well, but from the exhaustion of holding herself upright beneath so many hungry eyes. She rested her palms on the counter and drew in a slow breath, feeling her shoulders finally lower from the tight line they'd held since Clarice's performance began. But in the quiet, something else rose. A memory. Sharp, uninvited, but warm. The box in her apartment, the worn lid, the sketches she hadn't touched in years. She saw herself younger, surrounded by fabric scraps, pencils smudging her fingers, a professor leaning over her shoulder saying, "You have a gift." She felt again the thrill of seeing her work displayed under gallery lights, the softness of applause meant for her, not borrowed from someone else's world. The contrast stung. Tonight's humiliation wasn't just cruelty. It threatened to erase the last remnants of the woman she had once been. Lina opened her eyes, grounding herself in the dim service room. That box, those dreams, hadn't disappeared. She had simply buried them to survive, and Clarice's attempt to make her small had cracked something open, revealing not weakness, but a truth she had tried too hard to forget. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened slightly, and Helen stepped in, her expression gentle but alert. "I thought you might be here," she said quietly. Lina straightened, instinctively smoothing her apron. "I just needed a moment." Helen nodded with an understanding that felt rare in that house. "Anyone would." After a brief pause, she added, "They shouldn't speak to you the way they do." Lina looked down, unsure how to hold the sincerity offered to her. "I'm used to it." "That doesn't make it any less wrong," Helen replied, her voice firm though soft. "And it doesn't make you any less deserving of respect." The words landed deeper than Helen could know. For a second, Lina felt the fragile pull of emotion rise in her throat. Not sadness, but the shock of being seen. Then Clarice's voice echoed sharply down the hallway. "Where is Lina?" Helen glanced toward the sound, then back at her. "If you want, I can tell them I didn't see you." Lina hesitated. Hiding would bring relief, but not strength. She shook her head gently. "No, I'll go back." Helen offered a small, encouraging smile before stepping aside to let her pass. Lina left the room with steadier steps than before, not because the humiliation had lessened, but because something inside her had shifted, an old truth stirring awake, reminding her she was more than the role they tried to trap her in. The noise of the party grew louder as she approached the ballroom again. But this time, she carried a spark Clarice hadn't planned for, a memory of her own worth, resurfacing exactly when she needed it most. Lina returned to the threshold of the ballroom with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. The noise, laughter, glasses, polished conversation washed over her, but it no longer felt like something meant to swallow her whole. She stepped forward with quiet control, carrying the memory of her old life like a small flame she refused to let flicker out. Clarice saw her instantly. "There you are," she said, the smile tight at the edges. "I was worried you'd disappeared." Emily and Grace turned, eager for the show to continue. But something in Lina's posture made them hesitate. She wasn't shrinking back into place. She wasn't folding. Clarice tried again, sharper this time. "Come here, Lina." "There's something else I need you to do." Lina approached, slow and composed. Clarice gestured toward a new group of guests. "Take their coats," she instructed, an unnecessary humiliation, meant to remind everyone of Lina's low standing. Lina accepted the coats with steady hands. No trembling, no apology, just controlled, deliberate movement, and that alone disrupted the script. A guest raised an eyebrow. "Isn't coat service usually outside?" Clarice laughed lightly. "Oh, Lina doesn't mind. She likes being helpful." Lina didn't respond. Her silence wasn't obedience. It was a refusal to let Clarice's narrative define her. As she walked away to hang the coats, Emily whispered, frustrated, "Why isn't she reacting?" Grace replied, "She will. She always does." But Lina felt something different now. Each small cruelty only sharpened her clarity. Clarice's power depended entirely on Lina accepting her role, and Lina no longer felt compelled to accept it. When she returned, her presence shifted the air. People watched her now, not with mockery, but curiosity. The calm strength in her movements drew attention in ways Clarice hadn't wanted. Helen, standing near the floral display, noticed immediately. Her eyes softened. "You're changing." Clarice noticed too. Her smile dimmed, just a shade, as if she sensed control slipping through her fingers. Lina stood quietly beside the guests. Nothing bold or dramatic, just present in a way she hadn't been allowed to be before. And that presence alone unsettled those who expected her to collapse. Inside, Lina felt the truth solidifying. She was no longer the version of herself this house believed it owned. Something long suppressed had begun to rise, steady, quiet, undeniable. And Clarice, for the first time, felt it. Lina returned to the center of the ballroom with a calmness that unsettled the very people determined to belittle her. Clarice observed her closely now, the smile still trained on her face but no longer effortless. Lina's presence had shifted, and the shift was noticeable enough for Clarice to sense something slipping out of her control. Emily and Grace hovered nearby, whispering anxiously. "She's acting strange," Emily muttered. "Why isn't she embarrassed?" "She should be," Grace said, though uncertainty laced her voice. "Mother needs to push harder." Clarice seemed to think the same. With a graceful clap, she called attention from a small group of guests. "Everyone, we'll begin the welcoming line soon," she announced, "and Lina will assist. She has such delicate hands." A few guests chuckled politely, unsure whether they were meant to join in the joke. Lina heard it all, but the words didn't settle in her the way they once would have. Instead, they reminded her of every thread she had ever sewn, every stitch she'd placed with intention, every garment that had carried her signature style long before these people reduced her to a uniform. Clarice stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Do try to make yourself pleasant. It's important for people to feel comfortable, even when someone like you is standing near them." The cruelty was soft, disguised, but unmistakable. Lina absorbed it quietly. Then she lifted her chin, slightly, naturally, without defiance. Just presence. The kind of presence Clarice wasn't prepared to confront. A nearby guest, noticing Lina's composed stillness, asked her, "Did you help with the decorations?" "The place looks beautiful." Lina blinked, unprepared for the genuine tone. "No," she said softly. "Just the usual work." "Well," the guest added, "you carry yourself like someone who created something here." The comment struck something deep in her chest. Not flattery, recognition. A faint echo of the person she had been before life demanded she abandon her dreams. Clarice heard it too. Her eyes tightened. Lina's thoughts drifted briefly to the old box at home, the sketches, the fabrics, the life she once held between her fingers. The longing rose again, sharper this time. She felt it press against her ribs, not painful, but demanding acknowledgement. Clarice snapped her fingers lightly. "Lina, come! Stand by me. We'll start soon." Lina moved toward her, quiet yet grounded. Each step was deliberate, as if she were aligning herself not with Clarice's command, but with something deeper, an inner truth resurfacing. And as she reached Clarice's side, she felt it clearly. Tonight would not end the way Clarice intended. Something inside her was no longer silent. When Lina returned to Clarice's side, the ballroom glimmered as if nothing had changed. Yet the shift in the air was unmistakable. Guests who earlier looked at her with dismissive amusement now regarded her with subtle, lingering curiosity. It wasn't admiration, not yet, but it wasn't mockery either. And that alone unsettled Clarice. Clarice kept her smile poised. "Stay close," she murmured. "People need to know their place in a room like this." But Lina no longer absorbed those words the way she once did. They slid past her, powerless, as if they no longer found anything inside her to anchor onto. Helen approached gently, stopping just near enough for her words to reach only Lina. "You carry yourself with remarkable grace," she said. "It's hard not to notice." Lina froze for a heartbeat, surprised by the sincerity. Before she could speak, Clarice stepped smoothly between them, her expression polished but tight. "Helen, darling," she said, "Lina is simply quiet. Silence can sometimes look like elegance." Helen's eyebrows lifted, a silent disagreement Clarice clearly wasn't used to receiving. Clarice took Lina's arm and pulled her forward, not rough but insistent. "Come, stand where everyone can see you." Lina walked beside her, but something inside her had shifted too deeply for Clarice to drag backward. Her steps were calm, grounded, carrying a presence that unsettled those who expected meekness. Guests watched her. Quietly, thoughtfully. "She's very poised." Not at all like Clarice implied. "There's something striking about her." Each whisper fractured the narrative Clarice had spent years constructing. Sensing control slipping from her fingers, Clarice moved quickly. She lifted her champagne flute and tapped it with a ringed finger, the crisp sound slicing through conversations. "Everyone," she called out brightly, "may I have your attention? I have a special announcement to make." The room fell into an expectant hush, but Lina recognized the tone. The urgency masked as cheer, the desperation hidden beneath the smile. Clarice wasn't announcing anything. She was preparing another move, one meant to put Lina back in the small, silent place she no longer fit. And for the first time, Lina felt no fear at all, only certainty. The ballroom quieted under Clarice's bright, commanding voice. Guests turned toward her with polite anticipation, unaware that the announcement wasn't meant to honor anyone. It was meant to control someone. Lina felt the intention before the words even formed, a tension coiling in the air like a thread pulled too tight. Clarice held her glass with theatrical grace. "Tonight," she began, "we welcome so many wonderful friends and patrons. And to make this evening even more memorable, we've invited someone rather unexpected." A few guests murmured with interest. Lina remained still. Clarice's smile sharpened. "Our dear Lina will be joining us for the night, not as staff, but as part of the celebration. Isn't that delightful?" Soft laughter rippled through the crowd, confused but willing to follow Clarice's lead. Emily and Grace exchanged victorious glances, as if this was the moment they had waited for. Lina placed in a spotlight meant to diminish her. But when Lina stepped forward, she didn't shrink, she didn't fold. Her posture stayed steady, her breath controlled. The guests closest to her noticed the composure before Clarice did. Clarice continued. "After all, it's not every day that someone like her gets to mingle with all of you." This time, the laughter didn't spread as smoothly. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. The intention behind the comment was too sharp, too transparent. Helen caught Lina's eye from across the room, an unspoken message. "Hold steady." Lina did. Clarice gestured grandly toward her dress, dazzling under the lights. "She insisted on being here tonight," she added, twisting the truth effortlessly. "Such enthusiasm is rare." Lina felt the lie land like a stone, but instead of reacting, she let the silence build. Her quiet became its own form of presence, one that drew attention away from Clarice's performance. She could see the discomfort growing in Clarice's expression, subtle but undeniable. The room wasn't laughing as easily as she'd hoped. For the first time, Clarice realized her manipulation wasn't landing the way it always had. A guest near Lina leaned closer and whispered, "You seem very composed for someone being introduced like that." Lina met her gaze gently. "I'm used to being seen differently than I truly am." The guest blinked, taken aback, not by defiance, but by the calm truth woven into the words. Clarice heard it, and something in her tightened. She stepped forward abruptly. "Come along, Lina. Stand here where the lighting is better." But as Lina moved under the chandelier's glow, something unexpected happened. The room didn't see a maid pulled into a joke. It saw a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, whose presence didn't bend under pressure, whose calm disrupted the humiliation intended for her. And that subtle shift of perception, gentle, unforced, was the first crack in Clarice's control. A crack wide enough for Lina to feel the air changing around her. As Lina stood under the chandelier's glow, something subtle shifted in the room. The light caught the delicate lines of her face, her calm posture, the quiet strength she hadn't meant to reveal, but couldn't hide anymore. Guests studying her expected to see awkwardness, discomfort, maybe even embarrassment, but they didn't. They saw composure, control, something Clarice had not planned for. Clarice's smile thinned. She stepped closer, lowering her voice enough to keep the tones sweet, while sharpening the intent beneath it. "Try not to look so stiff," she murmured. "You're making people uncomfortable." But Lina wasn't stiff. She was steady. And that steadiness made Clarice uneasy in a way nothing else had that night. Emily approached with a smug grin, eager to regain momentum. "Mother," she said loudly enough for others nearby to hear, "maybe Lina should demonstrate one of her special skills. You know, something fitting." Grace laughed softly. "Oh yes, maybe balancing a tray, or showing how quickly she can—" But the joke died halfway through the air, because the guests weren't laughing. Instead, several of them frowned, exchanging looks that said, "This feels wrong." Helen took a step forward, breaking the tension. "Clarice," she said gently but firmly, "perhaps Lina doesn't need to perform anything. She seems perfectly capable of standing among us." Emily stiffened, and Grace's smile faltered. Clarice turned toward Helen with a polite mask. "It's all in good fun," she insisted. "Lina knows her place." Lina felt the words strike her like a cold wind, but this time, they didn't sink. They slid off her, leaving no mark. She met Clarice's gaze, not confrontationally, but with a quiet clarity that unsettled even Clarice. A nearby guest leaned toward another. "She's handling this with more grace than Clarice's," he whispered. Lina didn't react, but she felt the ripple. Clarice heard it. She always heard everything, and panic flickered beneath her perfectly composed expression. Suddenly, Clarice lifted her glass again. "Everyone! Before we proceed, let's take a moment to acknowledge how devoted Lina is. Truly, she works tirelessly, even if she isn't refined enough for evenings like this." The insult was sugar-coated, but unmistakable. This time, the silence that followed wasn't amused. It was uncomfortable. Someone cleared their throat. Another looked away. Helen folded her arms, and Lina understood something clearly. Clarice wasn't trying to humiliate her anymore. She was trying to win back the room, because the room was slipping. Lina stood a little taller, not to challenge, but because she no longer carried the weight Clarice wanted her to bear. The truth inside her, once quiet, was gathering strength, and the more she embraced it, the more the guests saw it too. Lina wasn't the weak link in the room. She was the calm center, the one holding steady while Clarice unraveled. The ballroom did not return to its earlier confidence. Clarice's failed attempt at humor left the air strangely brittle, as if everyone sensed a shift they couldn't name. Lina felt it too, an undercurrent pulling attention toward her, not out of mockery this time, but out of something far more dangerous for Clarice: curiosity. Clarice's smile faltered at the edges. She signaled Emily subtly, urging her to redirect the room. But before Emily could act, a woman in a gold dress approached Lina with deliberate interest. "Your dress," she said, eyes narrowing slightly as she examined the stitching. "It's hand-sewn, isn't it?" Lina's hands pressed lightly against the fabric, almost protectively. "Yes," she answered, voice calm. "It's beautifully done," the woman continued. "Who designed it?" Lina inhaled softly, ready to answer, but Clarice swooped in with a sharp, sugary laugh. "Oh, that old handmade thing," Clarice said. She picked it up secondhand. "Nothing remarkable." The woman didn't buy it. She turned back to Lina. "Is that true?" For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Lina lifted her gaze. Her voice was quiet, but unmistakably firm. "No, I designed it." A ripple spread through the nearest guests, subtle but immediate, an awareness settling over them. Clarice's smile froze. The woman leaned closer, intrigued now. "You designed this. Then you've trained." The structure alone shows skill. Lina didn't boast. She didn't shrink. I studied, she said simply. Emily's eyes widened. Grace whispered something under her breath. Clarice, for the first time that evening, looked genuinely unprepared. She forced a laugh, too quick, too strained. Oh, please, Lina exaggerates. She was never… But the woman interrupted gently, tapping the sleeve with thoughtful fingers. No, this is the work of someone who understands fabric, design, and intention. This is real craft. More guests drifted closer, drawn by the shift in tone. Lina felt their attention land on her, not as an object of entertainment, but as someone whose presence suddenly meant something different. Clarice tried to regain control, straightening her shoulders, but it was too late. A truth that she had spent years burying under chores, uniforms, and silence had slipped into the open, quietly, unmistakably. Lina's truth, her past, her skill, and the room had finally, undeniably seen it. The small crowd around Lina grew almost imperceptibly, drawn by the shift in tone, by the realization that something meaningful had surfaced where a spectacle was supposed to be. Clarice watched the guests examine Lina's dress with genuine interest, and a faint panic flickered across her features. She tried to hide it behind a brittle smile, but her eyes betrayed urgency. Everyone is getting carried away, Clarice said lightly, stepping closer as if she could physically shield Lina from the rising attention. It's just a simple dress, nothing more. But the woman in gold wasn't the only one now intrigued. A man with a sharp eye for detail leaned in. Look at the darts on the bodice. Those aren't amateur. Another guest nodded. And the hem, perfectly even. That takes training. Clarice's composure cracked. Really? There's no need to… Clarice, Helen cut in gently. Maybe let her speak for herself. The room shifted again. Guests turned toward Lina, waiting. Not for Clarice's version, but for hers. Lina felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. But for once, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like something aligning, like a truth long pressed down, finally finding air. I studied textile design, Lina said softly, before I worked here. A few gasps sounded. Quiet, but unmistakably respectful. Where? Someone asked. Lina hesitated, not out of shame, but out of the fragile disbelief that the room suddenly wanted her answer. At a design school. I had a scholarship. Clarice's face drained of color. Emily swallowed hard. Grace looked away. A murmur moved through the guests. Surprise, curiosity, a reevaluation unfolding in real time. So why aren't you working in the field? The man asked gently. Lina glanced downward, not in submission, but in memory. My family needed me. I left before finishing. The truth settled over the room like a quiet revelation. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't embellished. It was human, painfully, beautifully human. The woman in gold exhaled slowly. Well, your talent didn't disappear. It's right here. She touched the sleeve lightly in admiration, not condescension. For the first time all night, Lina felt warmth spread through her chest. Recognition, not of who she had been forced to become, but of who she still was. Clarice stepped forward abruptly, voice trembling. Everyone, please, this is getting absurd. Lina is overplaying her, but a guest interrupted, not unkindly, but firmly. No, Clarice, you underestimated her. Clarice froze. Lina didn't smile. Her calm stayed steady, grounded. She didn't need triumph or revenge. The truth itself held enough power. And the room, once arranged to humiliate her, now stood in a quiet circle of respect, its center no longer Clarice's authority, but Lina's dignity. The ballroom didn't simply quiet, it shifted. The silence was no longer heavy with humiliation, but charged with revelation. Lina stood at the center of it, not elevated on any platform, not highlighted by any spotlight, yet commanding the room in a way that startled even her. Guests exchanged glances that carried a new awareness. Clarice's version of Lina had cracked, and through that fracture, the truth poured out, calm, grounded, undeniable. Clarice tried to recover, stepping forward with a smile stretched too thin. Everyone is misunderstanding. Lina has always been imaginative about her past. But no one laughed this time. No one nodded along. Helen folded her arms, eyes sharp. The woman in gold raised her chin slightly, clearly unconvinced. Emily shifted nervously, and Grace seemed to shrink. A man near the bar asked softly, "May we see more of your work, Lina? Do you still design?" The question struck Lina like a soft bell ringing deep inside her, a part of her she thought had died suddenly responding. "I'm still here." She hesitated, not because she doubted herself, but because the reality of being seen, truly seen, felt overwhelming after years of invisibility. "I haven't designed anything in a long time," she admitted. "But I used to, before life changed." Helen stepped closer. "But your skill clearly didn't disappear." Another guest nodded. "Talent like that doesn't fade." Clarice's voice snapped, brittle this time. "Enough. She's a maid, not a designer. Let's not pretend." But the woman in gold turned to her sharply. "Why are you so determined to belittle her?" Clarice froze, stunned by the open challenge. The guests' expressions shifted again, not toward Lina, but toward Clarice. Doubt, discomfort, disapproval. And Lina felt, with startling clarity, that something powerful had just reversed. Her truth didn't humiliate her. It humiliated the lies built around her. Feeling the pressure on her chest loosen, Lina exhaled slowly. Her hands were no longer cold. Her voice no longer threatened to tremble. She looked at the guests and spoke with a quiet sincerity that carried more strength than any shout. "I never meant to interrupt anything tonight. I was invited, but not for reasons you might think." A murmur moved through the group. Leaning in, listening, Clarice's eyes widened, sensing danger. Lina continued, choosing her words carefully, each one pulling the room deeper into the truth. "I used to dream of nights like this. Not to stand here serving, but to show what I could create, to belong in a world where my work mattered." Her voice didn't break. It deepened. "And for a moment tonight, I remembered that version of myself." The ballroom went still, utterly still, because everyone could feel that Lina wasn't just revealing a past. She was reclaiming it. The silence after Lina's confession felt different now. No longer tense, but charged with recognition. Guests who had barely noticed her at the start of the evening now watched her with an attentiveness usually reserved for someone important. Clarice stood rigid, her smile frozen, trying to calculate how the room had slipped so quickly from her control. A man near the piano spoke gently. "Lina, if you designed that dress, why didn't you continue your work?" Lina met his eyes. "Life changed," she said simply. "My family needed me. Dreams don't always survive when responsibility comes first." The honesty of it softened the room. Several guests shifted, as if reconsidering her entirely. Helen stepped closer, her voice warm. "But your skill didn't disappear. It's still very much alive." Clarice's voice cut in sharply. "Helen, please. Lina is exaggerating a hobby, and you're all indulging her." But the woman in gold shook her head. "This is not hobby work. This is training, talent, intention." Emily and Grace exchanged anxious looks. This wasn't unfolding the way they had rehearsed. Clarice tried again, voice trembling beneath the surface. "She's our maid. Let's not pretend she's something she's not." Lina felt the old sting of those words, but it didn't pierce the way it once did. Not tonight. Tonight, she carried her truth differently, with steadiness. She spoke gently, but the softness didn't diminish the strength beneath it. "I didn't pretend to be anything. I was asked a question, and I answered honestly." Her calmness made Clarice flinch. An older guest with refined posture stepped forward. "Lina, did you study formally?" "Yes," she said. "I had a scholarship for textile design. I left before finishing." A quiet murmur spread, surprise mixed with admiration. "Did your professors recognize your work?" the woman asked. "They did," Lina replied. "I won a small award once. It meant a lot at the time. The guests reacted with genuine interest, leaning in, nodding, reevaluating her place in the room. Clarice tried one final time to seize control. "This conversation is absurd. Lina is trying to impress you." But a man near the center interrupted, firm and clear. "No, Clarice. She's not trying to impress anyone. She's just telling the truth, and it sounds like you never let her." Clarice's face tightened, her authority unraveling thread by thread. Lina didn't smile. She didn't need to. The strength in her silence said enough. For the first time, the room wasn't seeing a maid standing among them. They were seeing the woman she had always been, finally stepping back into the light of her own story. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted again, this time not subtly, but decisively. Guests no longer looked to Clarice for cues on how to feel. Their eyes were trained on Lina, their posture aligned with curiosity, not condescension. Clarice felt it instantly. The room, once her stage, had tilted away from her. She stepped forward with a laugh that landed too sharply. "Everyone seems overly enchanted tonight. Lina is being polite, nothing more. Let's not elevate a simple story." But the crowd didn't respond with the usual obedient chuckles. Instead, their expressions tightened, silently challenging her dismissiveness. Helen broke the silence first. "Clarice, you've spent years with Lina. Did you truly never notice her talent?" Clarice's smile faltered. "Talent? She cleans, she cooks, she designs," the woman in gold cut in, her tone cool, clearly with significant skill. A soft ripple of agreement moved through the guests. Clarice's fingers curled around her glass. "You're all being dramatic." But every attempt she made to steer the room back slipped through her hands like water. Lina stood quiet, observing, not shrinking, not apologizing. Her presence pulled the room toward her with a gravity Clarice couldn't compete with. The guests drifted closer again, forming an almost protective semicircle around her. "What kind of award did you win?" a man asked gently. Lina hesitated only briefly. "A design competition at my school. My work was displayed for a season. It was a long time ago." "It still matters," Helen said softly. "And it shows." More guests nodded. Emily whispered to her mother, "They're siding with her." Clarice hissed back, "Because they don't know who she really is." But the truth was no longer on Clarice's side. A woman with a silver shawl stepped forward. "Clarice, if she studied design, why did she end up working here as staff? Surely you could have supported her." Clarice stiffened. "It wasn't my responsibility." The words fell hard, cold, selfish, revealing far more than she intended. A few guests exchanged disapproving looks. Lina watched all of it unfold, not with satisfaction, but with growing clarity. The truth wasn't simply emerging, it was reshaping the room around her. Every question, every glance, every quiet defense from the guests dismantled the narrative Clarice had depended on. And for the first time, the social power in the mansion no longer belonged to Clarice. It was tilting, slowly, unmistakably, toward Lina. She didn't seek this shift. She didn't manipulate it, but the dignity she carried, the truth she revealed, had become something the room could not ignore. And Clarice, realizing that her control was slipping beyond recovery, prepared to retaliate, not with laughter, not with charm, but with desperation. Clarice sensed the room slipping beyond her reach, and desperation sharpened her movements. She forced a bright laugh, stepping closer to Lina as if proximity alone could reassert dominance. "Well, since everyone is suddenly fascinated with our dear Lina, perhaps she'd like to tell us why she really left school. I'm sure the story is illuminating." The tone was sweet. The intention was not. Guests turned toward Clarice, uneasy. The cruelty beneath her voice was no longer subtle. It was exposed. Lina felt the old instinct to shrink rise in her chest, but it didn't take hold. Instead, she stood still, breathing quietly as she watched Clarice perform a version of control that no longer convinced anyone. Clarice continued, louder this time. "Go on, Lina. Tell them why your promising future ended so quickly." She emphasized the words with a mocking softness. But before Lina could respond, Helen stepped forward, Clarice, enough. This isn't appropriate. A flicker of humiliation crossed Clarice's face. Public correction was something she had never experienced. She straightened abruptly. I'm simply providing context. People deserve the full story. But the woman in gold countered calmly. She is capable of speaking without your framing. The guests nodded almost collectively. Clarice's grip on the room had fully fractured. Lina took a breath. Not to defend herself, but to decide how much of her truth she was willing to share. And on whose terms? My mother fell ill, Lina said softly. I had siblings to support. I couldn't keep studying and meet their needs at the same time. Her voice didn't tremble. It held steady, carrying a quiet weight that the room absorbed instantly. A man near the back murmured, "That's not failure, that's sacrifice." Clarice flinched. Lina continued, I plan to return someday, but life became heavier than I expected. Her honesty was simple, but its simplicity was powerful. Grace whispered to Emily, Why didn't we know this? Emily swallowed. Because Mother didn't want us to. Lina heard them, but she stayed focused, centered. Helen touched Lina's arm gently. You made a choice out of love, Lina. That doesn't diminish your talent. Clarice attempted to recover again. This is being blown out of proportion. Lina is... But a guest interrupted firmly. Clarice, stop. You've spoken enough. The directness stunned her. Her face hardened, but she could not push back without revealing even more of her cruelty. Lina felt another internal shift, this time deeper, clearer. She wasn't just being defended, she was being recognized. Her truth wasn't something Clarice could distort anymore. Her dignity no longer lived in the shadows of the mansion or behind uniforms. The room, once Clarice's audience, now saw Lina as someone worthy of respect, and Clarice as someone losing hers. And as Clarice stepped back, realizing she could no longer control the moment, Lina stood taller, not in defiance, but in quiet, undeniable presence. The ballroom felt different now, charged, alert, as if every guest sensed they were witnessing a shift larger than the evening itself. Lina didn't move, yet the room gravitated toward her with quiet intent. The soft glow of the chandeliers seemed to frame her, rather than the woman who had hosted the event. Clarice lingered at the edge of the crowd. Her daughters pressed close, no longer confident but unsettled. Emily whispered, They're circling her, Mother. Clarice didn't answer. She watched Lina with a tightening jaw, as if unable to understand how the narrative of the night had slipped from her grasp. The woman in the gold dress approached Lina again, now with a sharper, more deliberate curiosity. Your technique is unmistakable, she said, lightly touching the sleeve. Do you have more designs? Lina took a breath, measured, steady. I have older sketches, she said. Pieces I made before I left school. The woman smiled. Then you still have a designer's mind. Creative instinct doesn't fade. A man nearby added, If this dress is your work, I'd be interested to see what else you've made. Before Lina could respond, another figure stepped forward, calm, composed, assessing. I'm Dana, she said. I curate collections for emerging designers, and what you're wearing tonight is more refined than many pieces I've showcased. Lina blinked, absorbing the words carefully. Dana continued, If you have a portfolio, even old sketches, I'd like to review them. Are you available tomorrow? The question hung in the air like a spark. Clarice reacted instantly. Dana, really? She's staff here. She's not... But Dana didn't even glance her way. She's talented. That's what matters. A ripple of agreement moved through the guests. Quiet nods, approving murmurs. Clarice's voice caught in her throat. Lina looked at Dana, uncertain but steady. I still have my work, she said softly. I kept everything, even when I wasn't sure why. Good, Dana replied. Bring it. I'd like to see what you're capable of. The words struck Lina with a force she hadn't expected, not heavy, but awakening. It felt like someone had opened a window in a room she'd forgotten she was trapped inside. Emily's breath hitched. Grace looked away entirely. Clarice's face drained of its practiced confidence. Because the opportunity forming in front of Lina wasn't symbolic. It was real, tangible. A door opening exactly where Clarice had tried to build a wall. Lina exhaled slowly, her chest warm, her heartbeat steady. For the first time in years, she wasn't imagining a future. She was being invited into one. Lina felt the air around her shift again, not with tension this time, but with possibility so vivid it almost startled her. Dana's invitation hovered in her mind like a soft, steady light. The guests sensed it too. Their expressions held curiosity, respect, even admiration. It was as if the room had collectively decided to see her, truly see her, for the first time. Dana took a step closer, her tone warm but entirely professional. You have an eye for structure and detail, Lina. If your other pieces show this level of precision, you could absolutely return to the field. Lina's breath trembled, not from fear, but from a long-suppressed dream resurfacing with a force she wasn't prepared for. I haven't designed anything in years, she admitted quietly. That doesn't diminish what you're capable of now, Dana replied. Some talents go dormant, but they don't disappear. A few guests nodded in agreement. Even those who had previously laughed at Lina now watched her with the soft awe reserved for witnessing someone reclaim something precious. Helen spoke next. You should take the chance, Lina. This isn't just praise. It's a real door opening. Lina glanced downward, the weight of the night settling into her hands. I never thought I'd have another opportunity, she said. I thought that part of my life was gone. The woman in gold stepped nearer. It wasn't gone, she said gently. It was covered. Tonight uncovered it. Behind the cluster of guests, Clarice stiffened. Emily tugged at her arm, whispering, Mother, stop staring. People are noticing. But Clarice's eyes were locked on Lina, on the cracks forming in the life she had built by keeping her staff silent and small. She stepped forward abruptly. This is ridiculous, Clarice snapped, her composure breaking. She has responsibilities. She can't chase childish dreams. But this time, the room recoiled. A man near the front said firmly, Dreams aren't childish when they come with skill. Dana's expression hardened. Clarice, you've made your position clear, but Lina is the only one who gets to decide her future. The words struck like a quiet thunderbolt. Lina lifted her head slowly. The tension in her shoulders eased as she realized something profound. For the first time in years, the choice truly was hers. I'd like to come tomorrow, she said, voice steady. I want to show you what I've made. Dana smiled. Good. I look forward to it. Clarice inhaled sharply, fury trembling beneath her perfect exterior. But no one looked at her anymore. No one echoed her indignation. The room had shifted entirely. The power no longer belonged to the hostess. It belonged to the woman in the handmade dress, the one who had stopped shrinking, the one who carried her truth with quiet courage, the one finally stepping toward the future she thought she'd lost. The moment Lina accepted Dana's invitation, the ballroom changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, yet every guest felt the shift. Conversations softened, expressions warmed, and the atmosphere tilted unmistakably toward her. For the first time that evening, the room belonged not to the hostess, but to the woman in the handmade dress. Clarice felt it like a blow. She stood rigid near the center, her posture tense, her daughters hovering beside her like fading shadows. Emily whispered, Mother, everyone's looking at Lina. Grace avoided Clarice's eyes completely, as if witnessing something she didn't know how to understand. Clarice stepped forward, her voice trembling beneath its polished surface. This is nonsense, she snapped. Lina has work here, responsibilities. She can't just chase fantasies. Her words struck the room with a hollow clang. Dana answered first, calm and direct. It isn't a fantasy, it's talent, and it deserves to be explored. Clarice's jaw tightened so sharply it seemed painful. She is staff, she insisted, desperate now. Nothing more. But the woman in gold spoke firmly. You're wrong. Lina is clearly more than the role you kept her in. Guests murmured in agreement. A few even stepped subtly closer to Lina, forming a loose shield around her, unplanned, unconscious, but unmistakably protective. Clarice's composure cracked. "Lina," she demanded, "tell them you belong here. Tell them you're grateful. Tell them—" Lina didn't move toward her. She didn't bow her head. She didn't apologize. Instead, her voice emerged steady and low, carrying across the room with unexpected strength. "I am grateful for the work I've done here," she said. "But grateful does not mean small, and it does not mean I must remain where I stopped growing." The words landed with the weight of truth, not accusation. Helen stepped closer to Lina, gently but decisively. "You owe no one the abandonment of your potential," she said. "Not tonight, not ever." Clarice's face paled. Her certainty, her control, her narrative had collapsed entirely. And yet Lina didn't look triumphant. She looked centered, present, finally aligned with a self she had buried for too long. The ballroom watched her with a reverence that hadn't existed minutes before. She wasn't the servant they'd overlooked. She was the woman rising in front of them. The air inside the ballroom felt strangely weightless now, as if the tension that had ruled the evening had finally snapped. Guests no longer watched Clarice for cues. They watched Lina, quietly aligning themselves with the dignity she carried so effortlessly. Even the music seemed to soften around her, adjusting to the new emotional center of the room. Clarice, pale and shaken, made one last attempt to reclaim authority. "Lina," she said sharply, "you are forgetting your place." But the words sounded small, shrill, even, in a room that had already decided otherwise. Lina turned toward her, not confrontational, but steady. "I'm not forgetting anything," she said gently. "I'm remembering who I was before I stopped believing I still had worth outside these walls." The murmur that followed wasn't shock. It was admiration. Dana stepped forward again. "Lina, you should go home early tonight. Rest. Prepare your portfolio. You have a full day ahead of you tomorrow." Clarice's eyes widened. "Absolutely not. She still has duties." "No," Dana cut in, calm but firm. "She has opportunities." Helen touched Lina's hand softly. "You don't need to stay here another minute." And suddenly, the truth of that settled inside Lina like a warm pulse. She didn't have to stay. Not emotionally, not socially, not physically. She had spent years believing she owed this house more than she owed herself. But tonight had undone that lie thread by thread. Lina looked around the ballroom one last time. She saw the chandeliers, the polished marble, the guests who had once looked past her, but who now looked at her with respect. And then she saw Clarice, trembling behind her perfect exterior, realizing the one thing she feared most. Lina was no longer contained. "I'll leave now," Lina said softly. "Thank you." Dana nodded with warm approval. Helen smiled. Several guests stepped aside, creating a natural, dignified path for her. As Lina walked toward the exit, Emily whispered, voice barely audible, "Mother, what did we do?" Clarice didn't answer. She couldn't. Because Lina's quiet departure wasn't an escape. It was a declaration. When she stepped out into the cool night air, she felt the world open, wide, real, full of roads she had convinced herself were closed. The mansion behind her no longer looked powerful. It looked small. And for the first time in years, Lina felt completely, undeniably free. Tomorrow, her life would begin again, not in service to others, but in service to her own truth. The cool night air wrapped around Lina like a quiet promise. She paused at the edge of the mansion's light, listening as the echoes of the ballroom softened behind her. That world, the one that once defined her, confined her, and silenced her, no longer held any claim over her future. She inhaled deeply, and for the first time, the breath didn't tremble. It carried hope. Ahead of her stretched a path she once believed belonged only to others. Studios filled with fabric and sketches, rooms where creativity shaped destiny, spaces where talent earned respect rather than suspicion. She imagined arriving at Dana's office tomorrow, portfolio in hand, standing not as someone seeking permission, but as someone stepping into a life reclaimed. Her fingers brushed the sleeve of her handmade dress. The seams were steady. So was she. That dress had begun as a memory, one she wore quietly, without expecting it to matter. But tonight, it became her truth. Her identity resurfaced, her dignity restored. The humiliation meant to break her had instead revealed her. The silence they expected had become her strength, and the room that once overlooked her had turned toward her with recognition she had never dared imagine. She took a step into the night, soft, steady, certain. Her story would no longer be shaped by those who underestimated her. It would be shaped by the woman she chose to become. And Lina walked forward, carrying not the weight of the past, but the light of everything she had rediscovered within herself. Her life was hers again, and it was just beginning. Which moment in Lina's journey resonated the most with you? And why? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might inspire someone who feels unseen or underestimated today. If Lina's transformation made you feel something, hope, anger, strength, recognition, tap the like button so we know stories like hers matter and should continue being told. Lina's emotional awakening doesn't end here. To stay connected to the message of dignity, truth, and transformation, watch the video now playing on your screen. It expands the journey and keeps you inside the feeling this story awakened.